charger. Death's alter ego lies in the wake of Thomas Ritter. Written by Jared Neely. Hypnosis. A prisoner, Thomas Ritter, facing a life sentence, suddenly enters a time tier. It takes him into the past, where he encounters life-altering events. His memory is scrambled, unable to remember anything of his travels through time. Haunted by his younger brother's death, he's unable to grip reality. Will traveling through time help him find what he's been searching for? Or will time run out before it's too late? Madness comes in many shades, but when it comes in red, there's a good reason for it. Dedications. First off, I'd like to dedicate this story to Sharon, last name I won't mention out of respect. But I can honestly say the date we had scared me half to death, and inspired me to write this story. Schizophrenia can truly scare the wits out of someone. Thank you. Secondly, I'd like to dedicate this to my children, Gage and Cassidy, Caden and Braden, and my girlfriend Michelle for being my stone. Hearing me out no matter how good or bad my day was, my best friend Liz for always being there for me no matter where we are in life, my mother Jody for listening to my bullshit and for caring for me after back surgery. My grandmother Jared Neely, who always watched over me and made sure I ate after school, my closest buddies Jesse Ewing and Gary Slentz, who passed too soon, rest in peace y'all. And Stephen King for writing works that had inspired me to do what I do. I thank you all. Sincerely, Jared Neely. Published January 1, 2015. The Midnight Horror Junkies. Chapter 1, Flashbacks. Thomas Ritter sat secluded, inside his empty cell, with his leg propped along the other. A pencil was in his hand, gripping it as he began writing a letter. The top bunk was ideal for a fine reason. Diseased rats scurried the ground below, especially after lights out. Detaching himself as much as possible, he replied to letters his wife sent him from the outside. Inmates occupying the prison didn't cause much trouble for him. Some had nicknamed him the Charger. Where the name had come from was a good question, although he never asked anyone for the answer. Thomas Ritter was sentenced to life in prison for a crime he had not committed. Every inmate had the same story, but he didn't fabricate his. Sooner or later he'd attainably accept it, maybe. Life inside the joint wasn't complicated. He'd write, sleep, and eat. Prison only allowed 1 hour of recreation. A diverse amount of inmates weightlifted or walked along the yard. Some of them even cut deals with others, who had outside informants. Thomas scoffed at the thought of it, recreation. Animals lived there, and they could have that precious hour. But Thomas wasn't a part of that. What his priorities were in his cell. Signing the page, he scribbled his name along the bottom right of it. Peering at the letter, he noticed the date. It was 1983, 2 years had already swiftly passed. A memory from his childhood suddenly surfaced inside his thoughts. Continuing to stare at the freshly blotched numbers along the top of the page, his thoughts took him somewhere else in time. A flashback of his parents' home abruptly swept over him. It was Thanksgiving and his brother was only a baby, just in the stages of learning to crawl. Standing along the stairway, he observed him playing with his wooden alphabet blocks. Adam, he hadn't intentionally thought about him in years. He knelt down, taking in his baby face. It was hard, but he did. Thomas was only a 10-year-old boy when Adam drowned out behind their countryside Lancaster ranch home. Still staring at his younger brother, he could hear his father's record player blaring. It was resonating from the kitchen. Standing tall, he left Adam there playing. He approached the sound of the Beatles bellowing from the kitchen in the distance. It was a song he remembered, "I Wanna Hold Your Hand." Thomas's mother was dancing to it as she fixed batter, mixing it in a round bowl, preparing a fudge cake. His father must have been away working long hours. He was absent again. It wasn't unusual for him to plug himself in the way he did. He was barely home for them. Staring at the kitchen table, Mother had decorated it for the coming holiday. Assortments of plastic fruit and a ceramic pilgrim lay in the center of it. She'd always been one to do that. Bringing life to the holiday parties was her way. Suddenly, the overly honed pencil dropped onto the paper below. His eyes widened, realizing he had been daydreaming again. The haunting noise of cells slamming shut echoed into his ears. An unforgettable sound churning through his head like broken glass. One that reminded him of death by electric. The idea of it gave him chills. He had seen inmates take the walk. The walk was your last and came right after your final meal, and that was death row. Devastating thoughts ran through him as he lowered himself, laying his body along the hardness of the bunk. His head was down onto his elbows, resting along the thin linen. He listened to his own thoughts. Earlier in time. The evening had suddenly arrived with a hideous colliginous sky and a classroom full of spilt blood. A horrific massacre had taken place hours earlier. Detectives trudged through snapping photographs and sketching profiles. Bodies were barricading the doorway and others were lying under desks. Trails of human remains etched a grisly scene in mist of a broken town. Lancaster, Arkansas, a town mostly occupied of simple folk, was a place thought of for its Southern traditions. On Saturday afternoons, families would turn on the set and watch either the Razorbacks, or whomever else playing that afternoon. Possibly, even catch Bonanza or the Andy Griffith Show, before turning over for the night. Their doors were left unlocked then, and it felt safe that way. Until now. It was January 9 of 1963, months before Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous "I Have a Dream" speech, and the John F. Kennedy's assassination. Life has always been full of history-altering events, but in 1963 something even more amazing occurred, that had since been forgotten. Only one person had lived to tell it since then, and he's the lone one out of many who could tell the whole side of it all. Chapter 2, Prison Politics. Thomas Ritter stared at the filthy ceiling above him. It was covered in dead bugs and squash roaches. Listening to the inmates in the cell beside his, he could hear the night security officer making his way through. He ran a nightstick along the cold steel bars, signaling the inmates that it was time for lights out. The D block consisted of murderers and rapists. Thomas was neither. Adjusting was the most difficult part of his day. It seemed like every day inside the joint was just as traumatic as the first. The next afternoon, the convicts on D block lined up for lunch in the chow hall, Thomas Ritter included. On both sides of the chow hall there was a guard inside a glass cubicle. He stood behind it punching buttons on a control board. Another guard in the cubicle was on watch, pointing a rifle out of a porthole towards any inmates who were let out. During chow release, only 8 cells were opened at a time, so just 16 inmates could exit and walk into the day room area. As he moved down the line, he picked up his tray and used a water dispenser to pour cold water into his state-issued plastic mug. Afterwards, he followed the black inmates in front of him toward a table to sit down. Thomas sat down at the next available table. One of the Chicanos who walked with him ended up sitting with the last black inmate in line, filling up that table. His table had an empty seat and was soon filled by an elderly black inmate. He, along with the inmates, were being rushed and ordered by the guards to finish their gourmet treat within 7 minutes. A guard stood by each table and all 4 men must get up and dump their trays, and only 8 inmates are allowed out of the chow hall at the same time. Thomas Ritter knew since his first day, never to share his food with any inmate. Inmates could be checked for doing it. There was a code behind the walls: prison politics. Always stick to your kind no matter what, or you could get beat up or stabbed for doing such a thing. The meal was chicken fried steak. Percy was the only inmate who'd taken a shine to him. His only acquaintance, so far it seemed to be enough to keep the wolves away. Sometimes shit would jump off in the chow hall. The guards were ready to fire a bullet to break up any incident. About 2 weeks before, a white boy shanked another white boy in the neck for a drug debt. He wouldn't stop, so the guard fired a bullet into his leg. The bullet ricocheted and hit a pie saw in his arm. Thomas sat beside Percy peering at his tray, his mouth was watering. He grabbed his plastic state-issued fork and cut a piece off, tasting it. The inmates called it mystery meat. It wasn't a surprise to him, it tasted like shit. It came in a box that says, "For institutional use only." Percy told him once that the stray cats that come around didn't even eat it. That's why he always asked for extra rice. They were friends in the inside, on the outside the scenario would have been a whole new ball game. Ritter didn't share face all too often. He stayed quiet and kept distancing himself from the other inmates. It was his way of dimming the fire inside. The fire inside of him gave him bad ideas. That only led to something worse, bad choices, such as planning an escape. The fence in the yard was barbed with razor wire and the guards had it in their sights. Nothing came in and nothing came out, it's the only way the warden wanted it. The warden, James P. Willington, was a man who talked little, and when he did, it was even shorter. Prisoners to him were just numbers, and when he called on you, you came. If you didn't, things became brutal real quick. Chapter 3, The Guards. Thomas was back in his cell. It's where he felt most at ease. Behind the steel bars, at least in there he could write. Peering down at the paper in front of him, he began reading another letter that arrived in the early morning hours. It was from his mother. It was unlike her to send one, which caught him off guard. Before he even could read it, the words began swirling unheedingly in his head. Overwhelmed, he closed his eyes in hope they'd stop, and they did. The envelope lay beside him, torn across the top. It had come in earlier, hand-delivered by a guard. Thomas was lying flat on his stomach. It began to twist inside, tightening his chest. He felt a panic attack onset. Holding the pages between his fingers, a slight breeze blew past him. It was coming from a vent not far from him. His cell was frigid all the time, even in August. On his bunk he had a thin sheet, nothing more, and nothing less. Sometimes when he least expected it, the thought of hanging himself seemed rational. It was either freeze to death, or off himself before another frigid December came rolling around. Suddenly, somebody from the outside tapped along the cell bars not far from him. Ritter pulled himself up and crawled down from the bunk, noticing Stanley standing in front of him. Stanley was known for his overbearing antics and enjoyed taking his aggression out on inmates. "Ritter, let me see that letter you have folded in your hand," he said, standing along the bars. Ritter stared back at him, noticing him squinting with a cocky smirk spread along his hardened face. "Why? They're my letters, Stanley," he said, shoving the letter towards the prison wall beside his bunk. Stanley's face turned red, gritting his teeth. Ritter could see he wasn't the type to leave it go. "Listen here, you good-for-nothing piece of shit. You're going to give me that fucking letter or I'm going to give you a stomping you won't forget," Stanley said, frustrated as anger filled his face. "Ritter, for resisting my demands I could throw you in the hole for a month, maybe longer," he said, pulling a ring of keys from his pants. "I'll come in and get it," he said, attempting to stick a large key into the gate. Thomas's eyes widened. "Not a fucking chance, Stanley," he shouted in return towards him, extending his arm out through the bars. He fought to get the key out, while Stanley clutched them, shoving the key in to turn it yet again. Suddenly, Ritter's fingers gripped the ring in his hand, forcefully flinging them out of the lock and onto the floor below. Stanley gasped in anger, peering down at the keys. "You done it this time, 05742. Calling out the numbers on his uniform, he bent over, gripping the keys up from the hard tile. Thomas stood watching, waiting for him to try once again. But he didn't. He walked away towards the other end of D block. A moment later he was back on the upper bunk reading his mother's letter. From the start of it, he knew something wasn't right. Skimming his finger across the letter he began to read. "Dear Thomas, my beloved son. I'm writing you this letter because your father had recently been hospitalized. He had a massive stroke early Monday morning. I know that you have enough on your plate being in the inside, but I felt it was important to let you know, the doctors don't expect him to pull through. I've decided to move in with your Aunt Mary. The house I'm putting up for sale, Too many bad memories here now. I miss my boys, you, and Adam, and now this. The thought of it's become too heavy on me. It's just too hard for me to be alone here. Every time I sit out back behind the house, I see Adam playing there and relive the dread of him being gone. Just like, every time I walk past your bedroom I can't stop thinking to myself, that both of my kids are forever gone. I hope this letter makes it to you. I didn't know if I could even bring myself to write you. It's killing me inside to do this. Stay strong for me, and know you're always in my prayers. I love you, Thomas, but this will be a one-time thing writing you this. Forever and always I love you. Sincerely, Mother. Thomas folded the letter and tucked it back inside the torn envelope. Sitting there, his legs dangled from the bed, his mind was on many things. Especially, the thought of his younger brother. It's been a nightmare ever since. Another memory swarmed his thoughts, sweeping him back into a 10-year-old's body. They were outside, Adam was 4 years old, it was his birthday and all of the family had come over. A cake sat not far from him, Adam was sitting on a stool eager to blow out his 4 red candles. He was laughing, staring into the flames without a care to be had. His face was young and covered in sloppy joes. Mother had made them using her secret recipe, they were his favorite. Cousin Mitzi stood behind him, with her arms wrapped around him and the back of the chair. Thomas stared straight, watching the faces circled around the rectangle table. They were all amused by Adam. His reaction was spellbinding. His whole body was jumping in joy and he was spellbound about his cake. A plastic Scooby-Doo sat dead center of it. Thomas didn't remember the last time he'd seen him as vibrant as he was. The last time he'd seen him was when he dragged him out of the murky waters. The pond was only 50 yards out behind the house. They swam and caught crayfish there almost every summer until then. That was the last time he'd ever stepped foot by it. He watched him leaning against the countertop, the memory was surreal, as if he'd stepped back into 1967. He raised his head and opened his eyes, realizing he had nodded off writing again. Mother's letter lay beside it. The flashbacks were becoming more intense, he could feel his hands shaking as he placed his hands onto his face. His face was warm as he ran his fingertips down the sides, fighting to wake himself up. The daydreams had just started and seemed to becoming much more rapid, he silently thought to himself. Suddenly, the sound of inmates echoed around him. He could hear the guards running cell checks. They did this often. Some inmates were on priority watch, because of their violent histories. They would stash makeshift weapons in the ductwork or vents and other places they would find in their cells. Chapter 4, Hang Inside. Thomas stood by watching from the bars, assuming Stanley would soon be back and probably with a few more guards. He held on to the cold steel bars staring out, until he heard a scream come from the same block. It was a shrieking scream, the same kind he'd heard only once since arriving on D Block. A sudden patter could be heard from where he stood, a group of armed guards came running in his direction. The guards were holding rifles and were trudging towards the curdling scream he had heard. They passed him. As they did, Stanley peered inwards at him standing there by the lock. His spiteful eyes traced Thomas as he disappeared from his view. He stood along his cell holding the bars with both hands, listening to the commotion not far from him. The guards were arguing with one another, until one of them stopped and unlocked the cell. "Yes, sir," he used his sheet, he cried over at the rest, standing along. "I'll cut him down, but I'm not taking heat from the warden over this," shouted another guard, holding a nightstick. "Fucker had it coming, but the family won't be satisfied with it," he then added. He had a date lined up for this week, with old Sparky. Stanley said unemotionally. Thomas Ritter stood at his cell, and could hear them all talking amongst each other. Along the top bunk, he peered downwards at the puny cell surrounding him. It was empty, other than the pencil and a writing tablet given to him. Percy snuck it into him for swamping him cigarettes a few weeks earlier. Suddenly, Thomas turned from his bunk and noticed 5 prison guards were standing outside of his cell. "Thomas, come here," demanded one of the guards. He didn't budge. "Why?" he asked, peering at the guards. His chest began racing sporadically. "Trust me, you don't want to play this game, Tom," shouted Stanley, standing behind the others. "Why are you resisting us, Ritter?" asked the guard, as he unclipped the keys from his uniform. "This isn't like you, we just want the damn letter," he continued as he stared, eyeballing Thomas. Thomas suddenly lowered himself as he reached the ground below. "It's my letter, nobody else has the right to read my fucking letters," he shouted towards the guard, becoming agitated. He stood in front of the lock, staring face to face with the guard, armed with a nightstick and a mace canister. "Let's get him. I think this shit pile needs a little reminder," he shouted, as the guards swarmed in through the gate. Ritter turned and hopped back on top of the bunk and laid there waiting. The cell slid open, causing a deafening clanging sound. Stanley gripped his leg from the bunk, forcefully pulling him off the top. He fell bluntly to the ground. The guards began shackling his legs and bracing his arms in restraints. The fall had injured him, as pain shot down into his left bicep. "Damn it, my back, you didn't have to do that," he cried at them. Suddenly, they dragged him out from the cell. "What did I do?" he screamed towards them. One man pulled him up onto his feet, as the chains dragged along the filthy ground. The guard didn't say anything back. Stanley peered at him as the guards held him in front of him. "Stanley, what the hell? It's my letter." Stanley stood as they locked eyes yet again. Suddenly, his face was red, and much darker than before. His mouth was twitching, and his eyes were bloodshot. "I told you, Ritter," he shouted as he clasped his fists, readying himself. Stanley kicked Ritter's legs out from underneath him, sending him downwards onto the cold surface. Ritter was on his knees as he cried in pain. "This isn't right, Stanley, you can't do this to me." Stanley's eyes were burning in hatred. Suddenly, he pulled his fist back and unleashed a heavy blow into his chest. Thomas fought for air, but his chest was depleted. He continued to cough as the guards standing around him began mocking him and laughing. He tried catching his breath. One of the guards watching knelt down at him and stared into his eyes. Ritter was now lying along the ground gasping for air. The guard grabbed his shoulder. "Hey, it's nothing personal," he whispered at him, as he stood up and kicked Ritter in the chin with his steel-toed boots. Ritter laid unable to get up, clutching his fists in defense. Stanley grabbed the restraints along his wrists and pulled him up again. He was shaking and sore as they pulled him further down the hallway of D Block. The inmates watched from within their cells. Some of them reached out from within the bars to grab the guards. The guards along with Stanley began dragging him towards solitary confinement. Chapter 5, A Way Out. A moment later Ritter found himself in isolation. Inmates called it the hole. It was a form of imprisonment in which a prisoner is isolated from any human contact, though often with the exception of members of prison staff. If an inmate didn't obey to the guards, they would often be put in isolation for 23 hours a day. Ritter had never been there, but Stanley had put him against the ropes. He stood there peering around the dingy room. It was emptied the same as his cell, and in worse conditions. Inmates had carved words into the rock walls, names and dates were written in the stone over the years. Thomas sat down on the floor, where it had been stained at one point. Inmates often urinated along the surface, unintended and left forgotten for days at a time. Right before starvation would set in, if you were lucky, they might just let you out for chow. He noticed how much colder it was inside as well, placing his hands under his knees. When he breathed, he could feel a stinging inside his throat. The temperatures outside was dropping as the days passed. Outside, the trees and wild shrubs around the barbed wired fence began dying and were covered in frost. It was November, but Ritter barely kept track of the months. The joint was all he had seen since arriving 2 years prior. Tapping along the filthy floor, he kept himself entertained, It could possibly be a while until Stanley came to his senses and released him. Sitting along the cold surface, he thought to himself, now covering his ears, they too were beginning to freeze. Tracing the walls, his eyes stopped as he watched a tiny shadow grow and shrink as if something was fighting for his attention. It was usual, as he peered at it. Nothing inside the puny room seemed to be causing the unexplained phenomenon. His eyes were fixated on the strange light source. It was dim and seemed to increase in speed as he watched it overlaying the crusty wall in front of him. Watching it, his eyes were drooping slightly, he had become tired. The stone wall in front of him reminded him of a life he'd been entrapped in. A murder he hadn't committed haunted him ever since. Thomas Ritter done everything to block it out, but the thought of a failing justice system was a night terror he'd possibly live with until his death. 3 hours had passed. He was slumped over, still sitting as he lifted his head. His eyes were burning from the cold and dust that filled the unfiltered air. Staring at the wall, he observed the same strange shadow rapidly increasing as he watched in curiosity. He felt heavy, and his legs were locked against each other as he sat. His chest and lower back were sore and the pain was increasing. When the guards had pulled him from his bunk, it had sprained him in those places. His feet were covered in filth, grime and dead insects were caked underneath the arch of each foot. In his cell, he had a pair of basic slippers the warden had allowed him to have. In solitary confinement, there wasn't any writing or reading letters. The only 2 things he looked forward to were now out of his hands. Peering at the wall, a large crevice cracked along it, running from the ceiling to the ground. It appeared deliberate, as if someone had chiseled at it with something sturdy. The same shadow flickered along it, bouncing as if it were alive in some extraordinary way. Thomas stared again, examining it, and the tiny room, looking to see what might have been the cause. He couldn't figure it out, as he sat against the opposite wall. Suddenly he rose from a sitting position and stood at the shadow casting along the wall in front of him. Approaching it, he reached out to touch it, stepping closer. Before he could make contact with the strange darkness in the unlit room, an instant heaviness seemed to be circulating inches from him. As he reached towards the wall, his hand seemed to cut into a thick energy pulsating around the crevice, left there over time. An unusual heat radiated from it. He could feel it as he reached inwards at it. The strangeness of it was unfathomable. It began radiating into his arm from the distance as he stretched his fingers out, in curiosity. Suddenly, he placed his fingers against the abnormal energy, streaming around the crevice. Instantly, a fierce energy swarmed through him, vitality unlike anything he'd ever seen or felt, entered into him, sending his physical self into impenetrable darkness. Chapter 6, Papers. The room was now a shell. Thomas was gone. The usual shadow culminating against the wall was also gone as well. Only the stained surface where he once sat remained. His cell on D block was also left, paper and pencil laid there untouched. His mother's letter also resting there in the envelope he'd torn open days earlier. Suddenly, the blackness overtaking him turned to a steady, brilliant fountain of light blinding him. His eyes were shut. Something had changed, but what it was, had happened too sudden to understand. His legs felt held down, and his arms were heavy. The same energy he had just witnessed seemed to be constraining him. It was wearing off, but the luminous light was still glaring before his face. He fought to see, as he managed to open them slightly. A middle-aged woman sat before him, as he peered down, noticing he was no longer at the prison. In front of him was an open front desk. Thomas sat behind it. No longer was he standing, or examining the strange crevice at the prison. He tried to remember where he was, but his memory of the prison or life there seemed off-put, and faint. Amnesia maybe, the source of energy that came from the crevice, had done something to his brain. Had it affected him somehow? He peered towards the woman feet away from the desk. Her hair was brunette and she wore wire-framed glasses, reading with her head downwards into a small pile of papers. Thomas suddenly turned, noticing they weren't alone. Others were sitting at the same wooden desks. Younger people filled the room, teenagers, also with their heads tilted down and reading. They hadn't noticed him. Thomas glared at the woman once again, realizing she was some sort of instructor, a teacher of some sorts. His legs were no longer detained, he could feel them, and his arms were loose again. But, he had no recollection of the room. He was calm, but something seemed out of place. He peered down at the desktop. A blank paper lay there, with tiny boxes to be checked off. He could feel something wedged between his ear and his head, as he reached for it. He clutched it, pulling a short pencil out as he examined it a moment. Fighting his mind, the unfamiliar place left him feeling displaced, but in his gut he felt even more lost and confused. Disoriented, he peered at the paper in front of him. A name was half scratched on it and for whatever reason left unfinished. Lester Bly. He wondered if it was his name, but the blank slate inside him had left no hints for him to figure it out. Lay, whispered a voice coming from behind him, as he turned to see. A teenage girl wearing a green headband stared back. She was smiling and wide-eyed. "We only have 5 minutes left, start checking those boxes, Lay." He realized she was talking to him. His face was straight, as he turned quickly back to the paper lying on the desk. Was Lester his name? It didn't sound familiar. He quietly began repeating it in his thoughts. Lester? Sitting in the seat, he gripped the pencil and began checking the boxes to a paper he was unaware of. There were 3 pages in all, as he read into it. None of it came back to him. Staring up a brisk moment, the clock along the wall was at 11, almost on the dot. The sound of pencils scratching into paper, he could hear it as the others hurried to finish. A test? He remembered nothing of it, or of the class, or of the girl who believed him to be Lester. Suddenly, the woman in front of the room stood up from her seat and waved a wooden stick at the clock. "Okay, everyone, put your pencils down, your time's up." The teenagers around him listened as they stopped writing. Thomas sat there watching, noticing a tall boy standing by the doorway. Nobody else seemed to notice him, as he observed from the desk. Then he fixated on the woman in glasses as she sat the wooden stick down on the desk not far from the chalkboard covering the front wall. The woman with brunette hair began walking towards Thomas, grabbing the papers from the desks. Some of the young people were holding their papers out in an attempt to get them to her. One student began talking to another about lunch, and others were laughing. "Hey, Lay?" asked the same voice from earlier, behind him. Thomas turned around to face the girl. She was staring at him and had a note folded in her hand. "Here, I'll see you at lunch," she said, still smiling, turning back at her desk. Before Thomas could turn around, a sudden shockwave, ear-splitting, as it echoed and shook the entire room. Startled, Thomas fell to the floor, dropping onto his knees, holding his ears, as he peered to see what it was. Teenagers were scrambling under desks, and hurrying for the windows, as another deafening blast blew past him. Lying along their floor, Thomas could see the tall boy blocking the entranceway leading out. He was gripping a sawed-off rifle, and aiming for the panicking crowd desperate to escape. Crawling towards the back wall, where some of the students had already been injured by the blast, he hid tightly under a desk lying on its side. He peered out again, as the tall man fired rounds into the room. His chest was shaking, and his mind was rushing for him to find a way out. But, the others were fighting for the windows to open, but they couldn't get them as quick as they tried. Shots blew through the screaming room, slowing as they buzzed past and hit the wall by the windows. Black powder spots filled the wall, as the murderer stood by the doorway cold-faced. Thomas peered at him. The desk blocked the view of the killer, as he ducked low. He turned his eyes a moment on the others crying to get out. Pleading for their lives, Thomas spotted the woman in glasses, the teacher lying just a foot away with her eyes fixated on him. They were still open, and she was lifeless, staring at Thomas. Her legs were tangled along the feet of another desk and her hands were out, still clutching a few of the papers she had collected a moment earlier. His heart thumped as he stared her in the eyes, the coldness swept over him as he watched in horror. The screaming was loud and ear-piercing, as he suddenly felt his legs become numb. Wondering to himself, he quickly peered down at them to see if he'd been hit, but he wasn't. An alarm instantly sounded in the hallway. Somebody must have pulled the fire alarm hoping for help. Before he could peek again, his arms became heavy and retrained lying there. All he could manage was to listen to the death, and the cries of people he had just found himself among. Again, he tried pulling his head up to peer from the tilted desk, lying on its side, but he couldn't budge himself. Everything became dark, and suddenly there was no sound. He heard nothing, no cries, no screaming, no thundering blasts whizzing past him. Everything was dark, the light was off, and he couldn't feel anything. Chapter 7, Choker. A blazing light shined into his face, his eyes were glued shut, and he could finally hear, but the noise around him had died down. It was silent suddenly. His body felt strange, his legs were clamped down, almost like before, and his arms were frozen but he couldn't feel them. The light was hitting him, it was warm, and it was gleaming vibrantly into his closed eyelids. The moment dragged out. As he pried his eyes open, he could see the tan bark underneath him. He lifted his face, still lying on the matted dirt and bark, noticing a group of children standing over him. They were giggling towards him. One of them had a mud streak across his face. Two of them stood there and they weren't as amused. The shorter boy, maybe 9 or 10, approached Thomas lying unable to move. "You son of a bitch, you think it's funny, do you?" he asked Thomas, at a loss of words. His brain was just as scrambled as before, maybe worse. The school was a distant thought. It didn't seem real any longer, almost fading into the back of his mind. Everything he'd been through was riddling out, he couldn't think clearly. The young boy leaned over at him, grabbed him by the hair. "Get the fuck up, Shane!" Shouting at him, his nails dug into his hand as he pulled him to his feet. The boy was wearing a dirty baseball shirt, reading Mets across it in bold blue letters. His face was covered over in filth, and his jeans were bloodied along his pant legs. A chain hung from his jeans into his pocket where he kept a leather wallet. 2 scars lined along his cheek leading to his eye, they were deep. His hair was greasy and uncombed, and he seemed troubled. Troubled, in an eerie, irregular kind of way Thomas hadn't seen in anyone before. There was something about the boy. The other boys seemed intimidated by him, as they backed away. They were now playing on the swing and crawling up the jungle gym, staring from the distance. One of the boys sat up top beside another, which appeared to be his older brother. He elbowed the younger one, and shrugged his head towards the woods. The woods were off in the distance behind the park, trees and rotten stumps filled the heavy vegetated area. "You whiny bastard, follow me now or I'll kick your nasty teeth in," he ordered Thomas, pulling him now by the collar around his throat. It was tightening as he stumbled to put one foot in front of the other. "You little prick, Eddie's gonna teach you a lesson," he said, yanking him along, leaving the others behind. "Who's Eddie?" asked Thomas, fighting to breath, as perspiration began dripping from his forehead. His lips were like dried leather, and his chest was bruised. He could feel it with every step. But, he didn't remember how it happened. It felt as if somebody stomped on him. "Stop, you stupid schmuck," said the irregular boy, hatred spewed from him, as he backhanded Thomas across the mouth. He hit the grass, rolling onto his side. The wind was knocked out of him, his stomach felt like a paper bag after being filled with air and then stomped on. Laying there holding his gut, a card lay beside his face. It was a school identification card. A 5th grader was on the front. He peered at it, examining it as the name didn't register anyone he had known. "Pete Sidney," he read it, and just as he did the sinister boy kicked him in the back. Spit flung from his mouth, as he held his stomach, crying. He was clutching the school ID in his hand, as the maddening boy leaned over and ripped it from his struggling hands. "Look at this faggot," Too bad nobody's going to ever see him again," he said, almost smiling afterwards. "The same way nobody's going to see you again, coward," he said, eyes glaring towards the woods. An unfathomable cold filled his pupils. Only a serial killer in the making would possess such a thing. "Eddie!" he screamed out towards the darker part of the woods. As he pulled Thomas peered back at the others still sitting along the bars watching. They did nothing to intervene. "You're 10 years old and not one trace of fight in you, Shane Donapue." "Dono, what kind of name is that anyway?" shouted the corrupted boy. "Sounds like a bitch's name," he said, pushing him down again. His face went into the grass this time, his lips split as he fell. He didn't know who the boy was talking of, or who the boy even was. The park didn't look familiar either, or the others left behind terrified of the angry boy. Thomas Ritter gripped the ground, using his sneaker as he stood again. The abusive boy smacked him hard in the back of his neck. "That's a good bitch, now move it," he shouted at him. "Why are you doing this to me?" asked Thomas, who the boy believed him to be Shane. He remembered nothing of either, but couldn't grasp the situation as hard as he struggled. "Eddie, where are you?" he screamed again into the thickness of the woods. They were now deep in and out of sight. The others were now out of view from where they stood. The hateful boy suddenly reached behind a tree stump, releasing his grip on Thomas's neck. Thomas took a heaping breath in, trying hard to regain himself. His mouth was dripping blood, and his stomach felt caved in, with every breath being more painful than the other. Thomas turned, noticing the boy holding up a decapitated dog head. It was severed from a Rottweiler. It dangled there a moment. Blood ran down his hand as he held it by a chained collar, its tongue hung out and was also draining onto the ground below. "Sick, isn't it?" he asked Thomas, standing in disbelief. In the boy's other hand he held a straight blade. It too had blood on it. "I guess you get to meet Eddie today," he said, tossing the head at him. He fell backwards as the head rolled across his shirt, leaving its blood on him. "You did that?" Thomas asked, almost fighting for words. Horrified, he caught his feet and stood by the Rottweiler's severed head, trying hard not to look at it. The crazed boy began quivering, as his face turned stone-like, raging as he stared Thomas head-on. Thomas watched standing beside a patch of wild weeds, and the butchered head. The boy appeared mentally ill as he reached for his face, unfurling the Rottweiler's blood onto his foaming mouth. Thomas, in terror, blinked his eyes confused and in astonishment. "Time for yours!" the evil boy clamored, suddenly charging him with the blade directed towards him. Thomas ducked, as the boy stumbled and fell, quickly getting up again as his face turned blood red. "I'm gonna cut you sideways until you bleed like a stuffed pig!" he screamed towards him. His posture revealed how psychotic the boy was. Convulsing, he began waving the straight blade towards him again from afar. He leaped again, this time the blade stuck him, piercing Thomas in the lower gut as blood trickled down onto the leaves. The crazy boy hysterically shoved it further into him. Thomas leaned backwards, hitting his knees into the dirt as his body became limp and motionless. He could feel his eyes twitching from inside, as they stared at each other in opposite worlds. Again his feet went cold and numb and he could no longer feel any pain. The evening sky was bright a moment before, but had suddenly dimmed down around the woods. Thomas lay along the dirt feet from the dog's decapitated head. The angry boy pushed the blade deeper, peering into his eyes. Thomas felt nothing as his breathing slowed, and his body began to lighten, leaving him feeling weightless. Something was running through him, a feeling unlike anything he had ever felt. His face became ice-like, and cold, and then he no longer could feel the muscles in it. The woods shifted into darkness, and the boy in front of him had somehow disappeared. Vanishing before him, his mind was an empty vessel as he watched the trees in the distance. Thomas was alone, as he shut his eyes. A moment passed by, attempting to open them, but this time he couldn't. Awake somehow, blankness filled him, His thoughts were again erased and something had control over him as it all went dark. Chapter 8, Bay. The warmth of the sun hit his back, lying along the ground unclothed. The sound of water folding carried into the air. He could hear it but hadn't turned over. A cardinal flew over, landing along the back of his upper leg. He was still on his stomach, unsure of where he was, as the cardinal tiptoed onto his back. Its nails dug into his skin as it stopped midway up. "Get!" he shrieked, startling the bird. It flapped its wings and darted back into the sunny sky. His mind was empty. He didn't know how he got to be there. Turning to his side, his eyes traced a plastic cooler sitting along the sand. A Schlitz bottle was smashed beside it, and a pair of black sunglasses. The brightness of the sun over him blinded him as he stared. Squinting, he reached for the shades. Placing them on, he sat up and strangely noticed his jeans were lying across from him, tangled in a thorn bush. One sock was on his foot, the other was nowhere in sight. His face felt blushed and burned. He touched it, realizing he must have been there for a good while. Standing along the embankment, he treaded over, prying his jeans from the jagged thorns. Thomas pulled them up, watching the water a yard off from him. He didn't recall being there in the past. Waves wrinkled inwards at him, almost reaching his bare feet. Stepping back, he turned, surveying the woods surrounding him. As he scanned the location, he spotted drag marks along the sand. They lead to where he was laying a moment before. Somebody or someone had obviously placed him there, but why? A folding chair was rolling along the edge of the water, broken and in pieces. In the distance he could see the clouds forming. They were becoming darker and closer. It gave him the notion that a bad storm was on the horizon. The sun glimmered down at him, as he stepped closer to the water, noticing a sandal pinned underneath the water. Dipping his bare feet in, he picked it up and turned it over as the water drained from it. The water felt warm, but carried a strong fishy odor. The other sandal was missing as he stepped into the shallow water, reaching the scattered chair. The water was darker and sandier and harder to see through, as he dived in with his hand. A second later he pulled the other sandal out, wedged underneath the chair. He spun around back towards the beach, placing the sandals on his feet before leaving the water. It was mid-afternoon and the beach was abandoned. The only sound he could hear was the sound of sand squishing underneath his sandals and the subtle tides washing up and back out. He peered into the thick brush surrounding the area. Dreadful isolation was filling him, as he walked towards a clearing where there appeared to be a man-made path. Thomas entered into the pathway, spotting a ripped t-shirt lying along the high grass and golden weeds. "Kiss" read across the middle, with a tongue and a peace sign also. He lifted it from the high weeds. It was torn along the shoulder, as he pulled it over his head. Peering out, he could see the darkened clouds nearing rapidly. The path was covered over in the same golden weeds and other high vegetation as he pushed vines and other debris from his way. Thomas trudged along for a short while, but there was still no sign of life. Until he reached another path that interconnected with the one he was on. Unexpectedly, he peered down into it, noticing its extensiveness. It seemed to be miles, stretching out into acres of wildlife. Suddenly, he lowered his head, and noticed footprints in the hard, dried soil beneath him. His eyes were fixed on them, but after a few seconds he determined it to be the foot impressions of a wild animal. He wasn't sure what kind of inhabitants occupied the island, surrounding the beach front. He pressed on, high-stepping along the massive path. The ground was covered in high weeds as he lifted each sandal, moving forward. Along the path, he stopped a moment, briskly placing his hands into the pockets of the jeans he'd found. He felt around, suddenly pulling a keychain out. It wasn't his, from what he could remember. It had 2 keys hanging on it and a graduation tassel. The tassel was yellow and blue and had the year 1972 molded on it. Above it read the school's name, Melford High. He searched the other pocket, but it was empty. Continuing down the thick path, he could see up ahead finally. From the distance it appeared to be the headlights of a car. The sky was becoming dim, and the clouds were now overhead. Thunder began, as it rumbled over him and echoed loudly into the land around the beach. He began pacing for the headlights. Each step, weeds tangled into his feet and slashed into him, leaving his feet burning. The headlights were still off in the distance as he plodded towards them. Droplets of rain began hitting him, as his shirt became heavy and his sandals sunk into the soil. He lowered the sunglasses from his face. The sun was lowering and the thickness of the path fought his every move. Folding them, he hung them on his collar, following the lights in front of him. Instantly the lights flicked off, and he could no longer see where they were coming from. Unsure of the time, it soon appeared to be nightfall. He could still hear the water in the far-off distance. The waves were becoming more forceful and driven. Thomas stopped in his tracks, tilting his head upwards, catching rain in his mouth. His mouth was dry, as he consumed the fallen rain as it drenched him. Heading in the direction of where he believed to see the headlights, the night sky was now black. Stars were shining from out the clouds, as the rain began to slow. He stared onwards and could see something off in the brush ahead. It wasn't the same lights as before. It was smaller and orange in color. The light was steady as he hurried towards it. As he approached, he could hear the water more distinctly, splashing and burping as it hit the edge of the bank. Chapter 9, Thieves of the Deep. Reaching the end of the path, he stood there, realizing it was a dead end. Water flooded underneath as he watched out at the sea. The light was out of reach, miles out. Thomas could see what appeared to be a cruise ship and the lights were shining aboard it. It was heading in the opposite direction, as he stood there sopping wet. His clothes were covered in broken wild berries and debris. "Son of a bitch!" he cried to himself, kneeling down to rest. The rain had finally come to a rest also. The moon was above him, full. It lit the sky enough for him to see just in front of him as it casted light along the water. All of a sudden, he lowered his head, noticing something floating against the bank. It began bobbing up and then down, as he stood watching closely, as the waves pushed it closer. His eyes were fixated on it. He fought to get a clearer view. Climbing down the side of the bank, 2 feet in diameter, he held onto an unearthed root growing out of the surface. Holding on tightly, he leaned over the water and put his hand in to retrieve whatever it was. It bobbed up again, as he grabbed a hold. His face froze instantly in fright, as he fell into the cold water, crashing fiercely. His body plunged under, as he fought to reach onto anything to pull himself back out. As he popped his head from the water, he could see the body of an attractive woman floating along, dead. Her hair was long and floating behind her. She was lying on her back. Her arms were spread out above her head and her dress was saturated with grit and seaweed. Thomas threaded above the water, using his hands and feet. A wave hit into him, bringing him back to the embankment, as he grabbed hold of a stone half deep into the ground. He used his strength as he yanked his body from the depths of the ocean side. Back up top on the bank, he spotted a large bamboo shoot leaning and half broke, lying against a wild shrub. Thomas kicked it as hard as his sandal would allow. It didn't break. Then he tried once more. As he put all his weight into it, it snapped onto the ground, causing a loud cracking sound. Back on the ledge, he stood leaning, pushing the shoe towards her body. He quickly tried to get it between her underarm and dress, hoping to pull her in. His sandals were slipping into the wet ground, as he caught her with the wooden chute. A moment passed as he struggled to bring her in closer. The dress was weighing her down into the forcefulness of the salty water. Again, he climbed down towards her, cautious not to fall in. Poking the stick, he railed her in, and reached down for her hand. Her skin was blue and purple, and she felt stiff. Thomas pulled her onto the land, trying hard not to damage her body any further, out of respect. Her face was pretty, although her makeup was smeared, and her mouth was covered in leaves and other sea junk. He leaned further to pull it off. As he did, his stomach dropped from the sight of her mouth and chin. Fish had eaten her, bone was showing and something appeared to be inside her mouth. Her mouth was shut and her teeth were clenched tight. An unusual noise began vibrating inside as he watched. The sight of her exposed chin and lower jaw made it hard to do, but he pried her teeth apart, as they opened, using his wet fingers. Suddenly, and shockingly, something was in her mouth swimming frantically. He couldn't see in, as he angled his head, unsuspectingly an electric eel leaped from her mouth. It wriggled on the mud, just a foot before his sandal. Thomas gasped, watching it, as he peered back at the girl once more. She was lying stiff against the wet surface. The waves were still exploding by him. Bending over to see her face, he took it in. She wasn't anyone he'd ever known, at least from what he could remember. That night he slept beside her cold corpse, until he abruptly awoke. The sound of a helicopter flew above them both. His eyes widened, in hopes of getting away from there, but seconds later it was gone as quick as it came. Thomas stood with his eyes in the air, until he could no longer hear it. He turned to his side to see the woman's dead, lifeless body, instantly stopping in his tracks. His face turned white, and he was utterly confused. She was gone? He scanned the area, puzzled over her disappearance. Thomas had both of his hands pressed against his head, as he knelt down where she laid just a few short hours earlier. There weren't any drag marks left, and there would have been blood left over along the ground if it were wild predators that had taken her. Thomas Ritter got up onto his feet. His sandals he wore were drying since the night before. He decided to walk back, to where he first woken, back to the sandy side of the beach. As he reached the spot, the cooler was still on its side but the broken chair had floated off into the sea. Thomas peered around the scene. The sun was now breaking up over the clouds. There wasn't any sign of another storm, as he tromped back into the water where the chair had been wrecked in pieces. His skin was burned from the day before. The water cooled him off as he reached the spot. The water was sludgy and not as clear as before, as he dunked his head under to get a better look underneath. Thomas came back up, took another deep breath and went back under. The water was above waist high now from the storm. As he dived down to the stony surface, he could see seashells and various plant life. He scrummaged the bottom, half blinded by the salt streaming into his eyes. Suddenly, he noticed something further off, in the deep. It was shimmering and gleaming as the sun shined down into the depths of the water. He swam up to breath, and then sank back down, heading in that direction. The water was thicker than a day before. As he pushed through it, underneath the water, it felt like an undertow was forming, pulling him out. Thomas fought to slow the current that had caught him, using his feet and arms, but its force was great. He could now see the object underneath the water. It had a curved handle. He couldn't see it clearly as the water continued to pull him along. He fought the current dragging him, as he kicked harder, swimming down to the level surface. His hands were shaking and cold now, as he gripped the object submerged under wet sand and coral life. Tugging on it, it released into his hand, as he swam back up to get oxygen. His head broke the water, as he came up clutching a pistol. A Smith & Wesson handgun. Thomas was unfamiliar with it. Forceful waves crashed into his face as he turned, peering back towards the land. He was out further than he'd been, and he was beginning to panic from the thought of being adrift. Cupping his hands, he began fighting the strong current growing underneath him. Minutes had passed as he peered again, noticing he wasn't any closer than before. Taking another deep breath, he went under, and tried using the frog kick to gain ground in hopes of land. His chest was racing, and he was beginning to lose his breath quicker with every thrust. The gun was still in his hand. It slowed him down as he could see the ground moving underneath. Thomas elevated back to the top, swimming with every ounce of adrenaline. Every muscle was burning on fire inside him. They felt as if they were ready to burst. He could see he was making ground as he clutched the gun harder as he kicked frantically. His feet sliced through the water, gliding until he reached the shallow end. He stood up as his feet gripped the sand-covered bottom below. Carrying the firearm in his tired hands, he spun it around, examining it closer. Inside the chamber there were still 2 unfired rounds. Salt water dripped from him onto the sandy beach. His legs were like thin wires now. They were aching as he lowered himself down. Sitting flat against the grainy sand and shards of shells that had washed up along the bay since the storm, the sky above shined down on him. He could feel it warming his shoulders as he sat peering at the gun, taking it apart. A moment later he pulled out the 2 bullets left intact, cautious of a misfire. Along the sand beside him laid a twisted-up paper plate somebody had regarded. Thomas reached for it, pulling it close to him. He then sat them there. Suddenly, a siren rang, roaring into the land. The high-pitched noise bounced from the water, echoing into the surrounding woods. Startled, Thomas straightened, peering in the direction of the noisy siren. He remained sitting as the siren wailed and broke, and continued. Curious of the noise, he clutched the bullets from the plate and slipped the sandals tied against his ankle. He stood up, wet and lost, staring into the heavy thorns not far from him. The heaviness of the woods made it near impossible to see through. Vines and wild golden weeds rose from the ground, causing an impenetrable wall. He stepped closer, leaving a small pool of water where he sat. He picked away thorns, trying to clear away, but he was already drained from the life-saving swim a short moment ago. Suddenly, he could hear the sound of angry dogs barking and yawping. They were far off, but it was deafening. Thomas stepped backwards, almost stumbling on the cooler behind him. He turned again towards the barking dogs, still unable to pinpoint them. The gun was in his hand, as he slid it behind him in the waistline of his tight jeans. Instantly, he could hear men hacking away in the distance. They were yelling and screaming at the dogs, but he was unable to hear what was being said. He could hear the sound of their machetes hacking through the thick woods beyond, as it rung into his ears. Thomas had become wary, as he turned facing the ocean waves wrinkling in front of him. Standing in his silence, suddenly a police chopper hovered over him. It flew quickly by, passing over him standing there. It was flying low, but he was unsure if they had seen him. It was all very sudden. His hand was along his back as he felt the gun. He stared one more time towards the oncomers, as his mind raced in anticipation of what to do. The men appeared eager to find something or someone, as they continued demanding each other and the dogs to get through the wild brush. Thomas stood along the jagged sand, nervous and lost. It seemed like eternity as he awaited the men. From where he stood they appeared to be furious and determined to get there. The thought of the deceased woman washed up into his thoughts as he stood straight before the heaviest part of his surroundings. Her face flashed in front of him, as he pictured her lying along the sand. Her hair tangled in rotten seaweed, and under ocean. Her chin and jaw half gnawed apart from tropical fish. The eel swimming in her mouth and how her eyes were fastened shut. He hadn't stared long the first time, but the memory was vivid as any he'd ever had. Something about the woman gave him chills. His arms and legs were forming goosebumps as he stood reliving the thought. He blocked the men out, as he thought harder into it. Thomas suddenly placed his hand into his jeans. Pulling the keychain out from his pocket, he observed it closely. The year on it still didn't mean anything to him, but the colors did. He didn't understand what made the blue and yellow significant, but it somehow sparked inside him. "We're gonna find him," shouted a voice, clear as any, but still deep out in the vine-covered woodland. Chapter 10, The Rundown. Suddenly, somebody from behind the thick briars and thorns fired a shot. It didn't hit him. Thomas checked his shirt and there wasn't any blood. His eyes were sharp, he watched into the bushes but still couldn't detect the men coming his way. He could hear chains clinging about, possibly being pulled by search dogs. Who were they searching for? He wondered as he stood tall before the overgrown weeds. His hands held on to a thin tree sticking out from the sand. His chest was pacing faster now. He didn't remember how he got there to begin with. "There he is, damn it, get him!" screamed an unidentified man in the distance. The dogs were huffing hard, barking and dragging the chains towards Thomas, from behind the mess of wild weeds. Thomas turned and ran straight for the path. His sandals were flopping into the mud, as he pressed on for the ledge, where he found the woman's body floating a night before. As he ran, weeds smacked into his shins, leaving him cut and bleeding. He didn't hear the men anymore. They were further now, and so was the barking. He crouched down a moment, breathing heavy in need of water. His head was spinning and a massive migraine had taken over him. He peered down, noticing his shirt had dripped worse. It was hanging half off from his shoulder, as he tore it the rest of the way, tying it around his shin, where he had lacerations from running into thorns and broken twigs. Still crouched, he listened carefully to the water not far from him. It was gushing and splashing as it hit the embankment. It would only take a few minutes to get there, hopefully the men wouldn't find him, he thought. He wiped the sandals with his hand. They were getting slick and harder to run in. The rubber wasn't holding up either. Soon he'd be barefoot again. He could see the stitching at the soles fraying apart. Thomas got up from the ground and slowly treaded towards the direction of the ledge. As he made his way, something caught his attention. In the high weeds not far from the trail he could see something unusual blowing in the subtle wind. It wasn't there earlier, or he would have noticed it when he went back through. Approaching it, he stepped over the golden weeds up to his waist. Underneath the wild plants he could hear an animal scurrying about. Hopefully it wasn't poisonous. It suddenly hissed at him, as he jumped back in fear of it. Thomas held his hands near his face, clutching his fists against it. As he made it closer, whatever it was had run off. He lifted his legs over a broken tree trunk, as he reached the woman lying there in the tall grass. It was her hair he had seen. It was flowing in the wind, drier than the night before, but some kind of insect had made a nest inside. Placing his hands inside, he picked it out as best he could. Suddenly, 1,000 baby black widows poured onto his feet. Biting his lip, he kicked his feet, desperate not to get bitten. Smacking his legs and jumping in the high plants, he noticed most of them were already climbing away into the dirt. "Nasty little bastards," he whispered, limiting the noise he made. He was shaken over it, itching his body and face. It was a phobia he had since a boy. Staring at the woman, he could see a dark bruise around her throat, he missed before. She also had a puncture wound along the back of her scalp that appeared to be a gunshot. Thomas felt for the pistol, noticing it had fallen out during the scuffle to get away. "Great, just fucking great," he shouted out of anger. Out of nowhere, screamed a voice. "Lay on the fucking ground." It was one of the men. The others hadn't reached him yet with their dogs. Thomas turned, peering him face to face, placing his arms high in the air. "I'm surrendering, but what for? I don't have the slightest idea," he said, stepping out from the body of the unfamiliar woman. "Murderers like you always get what they deserve, either in hell or in prison, asswipe," the man shouted about a yard from him. "Murderer?" asked Thomas, confused by the man's remarks. The man was wearing camouflage and had a mask and goggles over his face. Raising a handgun at him, the man was noticeably nervous. "Now, like I said, drop on the ground and interlock your hands behind your head," he shouted again. His voice was that of a middle-aged male. Thomas complied, as the man came towards him, lying there overshadowed in high weeds and plants. The man in army gear walked behind him, guiding him back towards the others. The dogs weren't barking any longer as they reached the sand spot, where Thomas had first found himself. The man in goggles didn't say anything as he shoved him through the tiny clearing. His machete hung from his side as he pushed Thomas through the trailway of slashed vines. The other men were gone, already ahead of him. They must have seen him with Thomas and decided to turn back and wait. As they both followed the man-made trail, the corpse of a dog laid on its back. It was covered in blood and had a survival knife rammed into its sternum. "What the hell is that?" asked Thomas, but the nervous man didn't speak a word. He continued to push him from the back, as they made it further into the clearing. Vines and rocks covered the ground where they walked. Thomas couldn't hear the water now, they had gone too far. He attempted to listen again, but the man pushing him grabbed his shoulders and shoved him harder. A moment later, he could see a car parked just before the woods. The country air hit his nose as they walked together, in its direction. Leaves were fallen from the trees by the two. They landed softly onto the ground where they both walked. The car was older. It didn't have lights on its roof either. Something seemed off to Thomas, as he walked ahead of the man. As they reached it, the man opened the back door and forcefully shoved him in. Thomas landed on his face and belly as he slammed the car's door behind him. His hands weren't tied, as he let them go. Squirming onto his butt, he peered out from the side window. The man wasn't there, as he observed the outside. He was inside a '65 Pontiac Tempest GTO. What police officer or a military official drove such a vehicle? He thought quietly. The windows were tinted black, and there was a cigar burning in the dash-tray. The smell of black licorice radiated from it, as Thomas peered again to see the man. Outside, the wind was becoming stronger, as more leaves began to fall onto the hood of the supped-up hot rod. The man had vanished. It was strange and eerie to him. Thomas watched the quiet street behind the car. It was dead quiet outside. Nobody had passed since he got in. He didn't see any houses either, only the country landscape filled the windshield as he stared out. The road was shaded and dark, and trees grew over on both sides. Chapter 11, A Rough Road. It was daylight still. Thomas sat along the bench seat in the back. The leather was cool against him. The shirt on his leg was still tight, as he loosened it and took it from his shin. Sitting it near the back window, he turned around in a circle to spot for the guy who brought him there. But he wasn't anywhere nearby. The car was off and he was inside alone. An hour had passed as he watched the tiny pocket clock hanging from the rear mirror. His stomach was rumbling and he was hungry. Any longer, he would leave. But the thought of getting shot was keeping him there inside. It was the only reason he stayed as long as he did. Thunder began outside, as he peered outwards into the dead evening. The man in gear was nowhere, as Thomas pulled the lock up on the door frame. It opened, as he quietly lifted his legs out and onto the ground. He attempted to open the front passenger door of the car, but it was locked from inside. Hustling to the other side, he felt for the door handle, opening it. He slid himself in, and could see the ignition was empty but the gearbox was dismantled. Somebody had pried it open with a screwdriver from the looks of it. It made no sense at all. Thomas reached underneath the leather seat, and gripped a small metal hook-shaped object. It was an old wood carving tool. It must have been how the missing man started the car. It was a form of hot wiring it, possibly. He shoved the hooked side into the ignition, cranking it until it sparked and the car shot on. Where the hell am I? He wondered, as he pulled the gear into reverse. He could feel its power as he lightly pressed the gas, turning the front end onto the street ahead. Then, dropping the gear into drive, he dropped the hammer and drove down the isolated back road. A moment later he pulled along the deserted road and went through the glove box. Nothing inside was of any interest to him. He then noticed a roughly cut-out photograph. It was sitting inside the door jamb. Thomas retrieved it, as he stared at the young boy. He was wearing a Halloween mask, and held a long knife on the photo. He turned it over. The year 1980 was written in pen. Nothing about it stood out to him. Placing it back in the spot, he pulled off again in search of a place to rest for the night. He didn't have any recollection of himself, or where he was. His memory was a blank stone. Almost like a grave marker before it's engraved. The road was a single lane and ancient. Even the paint was worn from it, as he gasped the GTO along in the darkening night. Soon, he approached a diner out in the middle of nowhere. Its lights were dim, and it had a glass sign hanging on a rusted pole, reading Dale's Drive-In Diner. Thomas slowed the car, as he turned into the empty parking spaces. Taking up 2 spaces, he opened the door and headed towards the entrance. He was shirtless, and his jeans were stained badly as he opened the glass door. A woman greeted him wearing an apron and her hair was up. "Hello there, mister, haven't seen you around these parts before," she clamored. "Not from around her, honestly," he said, staring her in the face. He wondered what her thoughts were, him coming in the way he was. "I see you lost your shirt?" she asked him, leaning on the counter holding a paper menu. "Long story, doll," he answered back, not wanting to explain it. She then walked away and cleared him a table, not that it had been used. Only one other table had a customer, as he sat down. Thomas didn't have any money either, but his stomach was hungry and he didn't think for a minute about not ordering. The diner was built from an old-fashioned colonial home, turned into an eatery. Inside, the walls were still wallpapered in a Dutch theme. The tables were long and made of lacquered pine. Even the waitress was dressed the part. She had a long flowing dress on under her apron. She also had her collar pinned over at the neck. Her hair was auburn and curly, and tossed up. Thomas sat staring from the back end of the room. He watched her, as she rolled the cutlery into a napkin. As his eyes watched her, she turned towards him, still rolling away. He smiled, as he turned back in the direction of the entrance. Peering down, he opened the menu written by hand. Suddenly, the door swung open and the man from earlier stormed in. It sent a cold breeze into the room, almost sweeping the menu from his hands. Thomas shielded his face with it, in desperation. The man still had his goggles up, and he was armed at his side. Both, a machete and a silver-tipped pistol, hung there. Thomas stuck his nose out, eyeballing the man. He had taken a seat by the entrance, the second row in, along the right wall. It was unusual for someone to keep his face covered for such a time. Thomas thought about the odd figure. He hadn't turned towards him, since sitting. The man sat straight as a log, sitting with his hands beside him. He could see remnants of the golden weeds clinging to him. His pants were splattered in hardened soil and his jacket held a handful of thorns. Thomas peeked at him from his seat. Suddenly, the waitress circled over to him and stood at his right side, blocking the view of the strange man he encountered earlier. Thomas wondered how he had gotten there as soon as he did. He could see the Pontiac gleaming through the row of box-like windows. The windows steaming up as he glared outwards into the night. The GTO was sharp as ever, one he always dreamed of owning. "Sir? I can take your order now," the woman said, holding a pencil and small tablet at her waist. She was holding the point of it down against the paper, awaiting him to speak. Thomas sat silent, as she soon tucked them both into the center pocket of her apron. "I'll give you a moment, hun, I'll be right back in a jiff," she said, smiling, turning away. "That sounds great, ma'am, thank you," he said in a quiet, relaxed tone in hopes to not get the man's attention on him. Thomas sat thinking of a way to get out, without him noticing him. His mind was at a standstill. Suddenly the man on the right of him peered over and held his concentration on Thomas. His head was cocked as he stared. Thomas lifted the menu again, holding it open over his face. He could see the stranger staring hard at him through two staple holes that had worked themselves out. The menu was split along the spine, as he gawked back at him. In an instant, the man began to pull his goggles down, along with the black mask covering his mouth. Thomas watched curiously. He then quickly turned to see where the waitress had gone. He didn't see her. Once more he shifted his eyes back at the man's table. Suddenly, his chest tightened, and turned hard. Shocked, his eyes blinked rapidly, opening and closing, almost in pure amazement. The man across the way, it was his face. It was eerily identical with the dead woman's. His face was roughly blistered, and the skin along his mouth and lower teeth was shaved completely away. Thomas could see the raw bone at the surface. His chin was sawed from his face and his teeth were gritting towards him. Appearing angry, the man's head cocked again, straightening up with his upper body. He could hear it snapping as it fixed itself in place. The sound of it causes him chills, the same as seeing the deceased woman's floating face up along the salted water. His eyes ran through the menu, as the man across the way stood up, slapping the goggles back over his terribly mutilated face. He noticed his hands for the first time. They were bone-like. His nails were inches long and that of an odd color, between a dirty orange and reddish shade. Thomas sat straight, placing the menu down along the pine surface. Continuing to eyeball the distorted man, he left his seat. The waitress suddenly rushed out from the kitchen door, heading towards the mutilated man. She held the same mini tablet and pencil, as she stopped at his side, kneeling. Thomas hastily charged for the doorway, not peering back. He approached the Pontiac, lifting the handle as it popped open, ajar. He slid into the driver's side, as the leather squeaked. Leaning quickly to reach under the seat, he took the carving hook and jammed it into the ignition. It didn't start. It turned and then died quiet. He tried it again, as the tuned engine roared, powerfully in the dark. The pistons vibrated and the exhaust purred loudly, before he could slap in the gear. Suddenly, the diner door in front of him swung open, barely from its hinges. The mutilated face of the man was barreling towards him. Mask removed, his face was crying in burning hatred. There were deep scars around his eyes as he charged for the GTO. Swinging the machete rapidly, its blade glimmered, casting a shadow into the passenger side window. Thomas could feel the blood rush through his body, in terror. He kicked the gear in drive, as the skull-faced individual chucked the machete into the passenger's door, ricocheting across the lot. Thomas slammed the pedal as it burned rubber into the unpaved parkway. It left red and black smoke rising towards the roof of the old colonial diner. Thomas peered back into the rearview mirror. The screaming skull had its mouth open, and his hands pointing towards the road ahead. Thomas turned back, grabbing the wheel in the dark. His hands were trembling, and his legs were numb from stomping hard onto the fuel pedal. The country scenery was now as dark as the night before, when he slept among the wilderness. The headlights of the Pontiac burned into the open road ahead. He was starving now and his gut was in pain. It squeezed and tightened, as he held on with his right arm against it. A sign reading Maple Cave 1 mile shined before him on the shoulder of the old stone highway. He hadn't seen a sign in miles. He would take his chances. As the GTO hummed to a slow roll, he turned off the isolated highway. Two signs hung along the road, one read Sanford Street and the other one at its side read Maple Cave. Thomas Ritter aimed the hot rod towards the winding road and into the unknown. Another sign hung along a telephone pole reading Maple Cave Campers Resort. Pressing on in that direction, he glared into the rear view once again. Thoughts of the unexplainable man ran through his confused mind. He tried to process the thoughts, but he couldn't find reason. Releasing the gas pedal, he coasted down the darkened road. The road was narrow and was rough against the Pontiac's handling. The GTO vibrated as its shocks bounced. Every dip in the road was intense. Thomas peered through the windshield, noticing a wooden sign that appeared to be carved by kids. Something made in wood class possibly, he thought. It had the same name etched into it, Maple Cave. He took the sudden right. Drifting down a small incline, he pumped the brakes softly. The Pontiac was half full in gas, the gauge was reading just slightly over the halfway line. Suddenly, in front of him he could see the outline of two cabins in the pitch dark. They appeared isolated and abandoned from the outside. Thomas pressed the brake line in, as the car came to an instant halt, as it dug into the stones along the driveway. He then jerked the gear into park, as he shut the engine down. Standing along the outside, a walkway formed with various rock formations, lead to the front deck of the nearest cabin. Thomas pointed his head upwards as he observed the cabin. It was 2 stories high. The siding was stripped off, but some of it remained. It looked as if somebody had started reconstructing the outside and had stopped in the middle. Antique shingles covered the siding underneath, giving it a haunting appearance. It wasn't your typical log cabin. It was pushing closer to that of a shack, a very large shack if that. Chapter 12, Back on Board. Thomas Ritter approached the door, as he stepped up onto the deck. It was dark, and hard to see inside as he pressed his eyes against the window near the door. The glass was split down the center, as if someone had thrown a stone at it, or slammed it down too hard at one time. His eyes fixated into the darkness, but he could see nothing. Blinded by the night, he tried the door handle, turning it. Suddenly, he turned around back towards the Pontiac. It felt like a sledge had hit him straight in his lower extremities. His face froze in fear of the figure, standing in the distance. His eyes widened as he watched. He could see the silhouette of someone staring right back at him. They stood in total silence. The darkness and the tall blackened trees covered the resort. The gleaming moon spilt onto the field behind the figure, where a white mist rose from the swampy field. Behind that, a cave of towering trees on both ends of the field hung over. Thomas stood for a brisk moment. The figure in the dark remained still and silent. The Pontiac was to its left and out of reach for Thomas. On the deck, he slowly stepped back onto the handmade walkway. Again he stopped to watch out at the strange sight. He stood on the rocks a long dragging moment. As he did, he could see it wasn't the man from the diner. The unusual character was taller than him, and was heftier. Suddenly, a buzzing fly landed onto his head as he smacked it away. Not even a second had passed, and another landed in the same spot. He shooed it off, as another came and another. They swarmed him, buzzing and fluttering in his ear, trying to crawl inside. Thomas turned in terror. Turning back to the cabin, he ran to the left of it, circling around it. The figure was still standing in the same area by the classic Pontiac. He ran, almost tripping over an old stump, sticking inches out from the ground. The grass was overgrown and weeds were left untended for some time, as he ran through them. He turned, peering back, in fear of the man. His chest raced harder, and his mouth was dry and thirsting for water. Nobody was there as he ran for the water. He could see the coastline. The ocean was splashing heavily along a landing dock. A small wooden pier lay over the water, reaching out into it. He observed it as he ran through the high weeds. Moisture from it caught him in the face as he ran in desperation. He finally reached the old worn-out pier. He stood just a second as he traced the ropes into the water. They were tied along the pier. Glaring out towards the two cabins, the figure was no longer there, from what he could see. Just the structures in the dark laid there in the far-off distance. Thomas hastily fought to unravel the Boy Scout knot that was tied to the John boat, anchoring it. His fingers slipped as he dropped the rope. Picking it up, he turned once again, noticing the dark figure standing in the wet, overgrown field. The shaded figure moved suddenly, jolting Thomas as he broke the knot loose, throwing the rope down into the John boat. The horrifying man in the dark towered high in the night, and his movements were unhuman. He watched it, as he lowered himself off from the pier and behind the small motor. His eyes laid on the dark figure, as he ripped the cord, starting the engine. It bubbled underneath as he toggled the choke, and held the throttle tightly. Frightened by the approaching figure, he glared, noticing its movement, sporadic. It made its sway, chopping through with a motion he'd never seen before. It walked as if it didn't have bones or sockets, or any other human mobility. Thomas pulled the throttle harder, as the John boat unleashed towards the deeper water out within the dark. Leaving the figure on the land, he turned again to see how far it had come. But, it was gone now. He held his head in disbelief, as he motored his way into the rushing water. A moment had passed, as he turned the rudder and stayed closely against the shoreline. Staying in the water, he shut the engine off, leaving the John boat coasting along the tides of the massive ocean floor. Trees and vines and other wild plant life careened the area around him on that side. There weren't any houses nearby in the distance. As he stared towards the right, he could still see the abandoned cabin site as he fixed his eyes across the water. He tilted his eyes downwards, exhausted, dead tired and overly hungry. The water boiled beneath the boat, bubbling and splashing, as he drifted in the silence of the night. He closed his eyes, resting them for a short moment. Thomas opened his eyes, realizing something had changed. This was the first time he could feel it as strong as he did. His eyes were opened wide, as he traced the dresser and the old bookcase in front of him. Thomas Ritter didn't recognize the room at first, until he noticed the picture hanging on the far wall. It was John F. Kennedy. This was his younger brother's room. His mother had put pictures up around the house of the president not long before his assassination. She adored him, although his father wasn't as enthusiastic about it all. Chapter 13, Adam. Pulling the covers off, they were the ones Mother had crocheted for Adam. He even picked the colors of the yarn. Blue and white were his favorite. Thomas didn't remember being on the John boat, the diner, or the dead body of the woman and the school shooting. Nothing about his travels through time had left anything in the present for him to use. His mind was as blank as a newborn baby. It was as if he'd woken up for the first time, each time. "Thomas!" shouted a voice from downstairs. He did recall this one, it was his mother's. "We're going to be late if you don't hurry," she said, calling up again to him. "Damn it, Thomas, we can't be late to your brother's baptism," his father then said, loudly up the stairs. They both waited downstairs for him. Adam was already with them. He was dressed in a tiny suit and bow tie, as Thomas came down. Thomas observed himself, noticing he had already been dressed, not remembering it. Wearing a black suit and red tie with brown pinstripes across it, he now stood beside them by the door. His father seemed in a hurry. Opening the door, the car was already running outside. The lime green station wagon was the one his father had gotten cheap. A deal he couldn't resist. His older brother had won it after a horse bet. He didn't have a use for it, selling it to him. Thomas remembered it all very clearly, as if it'd been only a day ago. The rest of them followed as Thomas sat beside his younger brother Adam in the back seat. Adam had a toy in his hand, a tin tank. It was once his, but he'd given it to him after he lost a tooth. He remembered telling him that he was the Tooth Fairy's helper, and gave him the tank. Adam's face lit like an oil lamp as he handed it to him. There was nothing like it, being an older brother. Thomas always wanted one, when his mother and father had complications. Until that day, they came home one afternoon from the local doctor's office with the special news. It changed him forever. In the back seat, Thomas and Adam sat silently as their father drove. Mother was on his side, holding his knee and fixing her hair in the fold-down mirror on the visor. The radio was off, as he drove down the decorated town ahead. Christmas lights hung from the street signs and stoplights. They blinked in many colors as they passed by. Thomas poked his head into the window. The glass was frigid, and his nose became cold quick as he lifted his face from it. It left a smudge of his mouth and nose, as he wiped it with cuff of his suit. "Adam, I missed you, buddy," he said, turning to him in his seat. He turned at him smiling. His hair was combed to the side and still damp from a bath Mother had given him. His hands were still holding the tank, his cherished toy. "I see you have the tank?" asked Thomas, as he patted his younger brother against his shoulder. Adam didn't say anything, his face was wide and he smiled forward. He appeared to be excited for his baptism. Suddenly another car came flying out from a side street before his father could see it. Everything went black, as the wagon flung onto its roof and spiraled into the sidewalk, hitting a pedestrian head-on. One of the front doors had flown off from the impact, and Mother had been rejected out onto the frosted ground. She was bleeding profusely as she lay silent, not far from the scene of the man's body. Suddenly, everything around had gone black. His body and hands and everyone left inside the station wagon began to dissolve into darkness. "Wake up," said a little voice, a voice of a youngster. "Come on, Thomas," he said, smacking him in the back to wake him. Thomas was sweating, and his face was wet. His eyes were shut tight and he was lying. "Let's go outside," the little voice said again, inches from his ear. It was Adam. Thomas remembered nothing of the accident, as he rolled over. "Hey Adam." he said, wiping away the crust built up around his eyes from the sleep. Adam stood in front of him, as he pulled himself up from the hard mattress. Thomas sat along the bed scratching the back of his neck. His hair was a mess and he felt as if a train had rolled over him. "Okay, Adam, give me a couple minutes and I'll take you," he said, as he smiled. Adam was wearing a pair of short golden-colored shorts and a blue sleeveless tank, as he waited. He sat before the bed, holding a tin scuba diver. It was the kind that had a wind up along the back. Having found it not long before out at the pond. One of the local boys had possibly left it, but nobody ever came by asking, so Adam kept it safe until then. Thomas was in his knickers as he climbed from the bed and over to the nearest dresser, built of a fine oak. He ripped a pair of his jeans from it, forgetting to shut it. "Hurry, Thomas." His younger brother was beginning to become impatient as he sat, hopping up and down on his butt along the shag carpet. "I'll only be second, if you want go ahead and start without me," Thomas said, still searching for a shirt. Before he could say anything else, he could see only a sudden flash of Adam's head storming desperately out the room. Minutes had passed, striding for the front door at the bottom of the stairwell. He stammered for just a second as he peered back up the steps, wondering if he'd forgotten something. The thought of Adam being alone surfaced as he changed directions and bolted out the door. Treading around the house, he reached the backyard. A grassy field covered the property. He could see Adam from where he stood. He was kneeling along the pond. Thomas hesitated a moment as he noticed something off-putting about Adam. He was staring at something, but he couldn't see what. Nothing seemed to be there. His mouth was moving, but he couldn't hear what was being said. An old curvy tree covered his view, as it stretched over Adam kneeling by the water. He fixed his eyes harder as he slowly plodded towards him. Suddenly, a bony hand from behind the tree reached for Adam. Thomas ran for him, worried for his brother. As he smashed through the grass, he could see an elderly man come out from within the shadowy tree. His hair was a shiny white and he wore a strange flattened hat over it. A hat from the Great Gatsby era, from the looks of it, and a Burberry trench coat over him also. His face was dark. Shadows from the tree covered most of it, as he made his way closer to Adam. From afar, Thomas could see his eyes were unlike anyone's he'd ever known. They were sloped and deep, and they glint of pure dreadfulness. The elderly man suddenly pulled Adam closer, putting his face against his ear. "Get off my brother!" screamed Thomas as he rushed towards the two, in the shadows of the outstretched tree limbs. An unexplainable darkness shielded itself over both Adam and the stranger as he came closer to reaching them. Suddenly, he tripped on a small possum hole, as he landed flat along his chest and face. His eyes shut just a moment, as he caught his breath, lifting his eyes again towards the pond. Surprised, his eyes widened in fear. Adam was gone, and so was the eerie man. His heart thumped fearful for his younger brother. Hastily digging his feet into the ground, he unleashed for the shady pond. Staring in all directions, both seemed to vanish into thin air. Thomas raced through the grass, finally reaching the lonely pond. He peered around, seeing nothing of them. His eyes traced the water, but he didn't see Adam or the man, or the scuba diver he brought there earlier. Along the pond, on the other side, was a flock of heavy-leaved trees hanging over the pond. It's where the ducks swam most days. The brothers often fed them on that end. "Adam!" he screamed towards the row of weeping trees. "Where are you?" he shouted as loud as his young, 10-year-old voice could handle. Nobody said anything. The silence of the pond, and the bitter breeze of the summer wind caught him as he stood glaring. It took 15 long minutes, despairingly worried for his brother, crossing around the pond to the other side. A long spruce twig lay along the ground as he lifted it. He'd hit the man if it came to it. He held it tightly in his grasp. The ground was mush, as his sneakers slipped and slid, fighting towards the weeping trees hanging over the pond. The air seemed thick around him, as he called out again. "Adam!" The sky was bright and the sun was high along the property. There wasn't a neighbor nearby for another 20 miles. Town was a long haul from the Ritter's place. Chapter 14, Numb. His nerves were rattling as he stepped over towards the hanging leaves. On the ground he could see tiny foot impressions. They appeared to be Adam's. Along the water just a foot from the branches leaning out over the water, was Adam's scuba diver. It was floating aimlessly in the dirty water. He didn't see Adam anywhere, as he scanned the water hoping not to find him underneath. The thought of it was paralyzing. Thomas peered back towards the house. It stood in the distance, and the field was empty as ever. The smell of the elderly man lingered along the pond. The smell of original flaconnets breezed through and over the water as he stood there in shame. He was shamed for leaving his brother unattended with a stranger. His head dropped in hopelessness, the thought of him being kidnapped wrapped around him. An hour had gone by, and not a sign of Adam. He'd now head home and tell his parents. His stupidity had taken him away, he'd tell them everything. How he left him go alone. It would be the toughest thing he'd ever do. The thoughts of it all made him sick. He felt windless and weak to the knees as he turned away from the pond. Tom. Screeched a sudden whispering voice, warm and shallow in his ear, as he flung back around. Nobody was there, realizing he was alone as he peered towards the crest line of the pond. Suddenly, he could see something barely. As his eyes followed it into the shallow water, his stomach burned like a fizzling coal had fallen into him. A tiny hand floated up, just above the rocks. It was blue and veiny and his fingers were curling from the coldness of the dirty pond water. It was Adam's hand. He was underneath the mucky richness of the god-forsaken pond. Thomas covered his face with one hand as he reached inwards at him. Latching fingers he pulled him from the shallow pool of grime floating around him. He bit down onto his mouth, as he felt the tiny bones in his fingers against his, and the frozen feeling of him being dead. It was stomach-turning. His clothes were covered in pond soot. Thomas peered down at him, heartbroken and gagging inside over the loss. His brother's face was a pale blue and his eyes were open and bloodshot. He could feel them on him, the same as the voice a moment before. "Adam, was that you?" he asked, glaring into his red eyes, now holding his brother's head along his knee. He was lying on his back as he combed the hair from his eyes. He was missing one shoe. The other was still under the water. Peering outwards holding his brother, the elderly man stood way out in the distance. Holding a cigarette to his face, Thomas could see the bright circle as it burned. "I'm gonna kill you!" he screamed, with his drenched brother resting against him. But the man didn't say anything as he turned away. Disappearing under the darkening clouds above, he remained holding Adam. Tears soiled the ground beneath the two as they dripped from his face. Soon, nightfall had come as he slept along the pond one last time. As the sky became a distant memory of blue, turning into black. It was colder than any night before. Adam's body was hardening over in rigor mortis from his death, beside him. His arms and legs were now freezing and shaking, the wind blowing over the pond was uncomfortably chilling to him. A moment later, unable to sleep, he pried himself from the damp ground. His parents were inside, from what he knew. Probably worried sick over them both. Suddenly, as he stood by Adam, he could feel a powerful energy holding his legs tightly to the ground. His arms were now becoming numb and slightly burning inside, as it pulled him down tighter. Instantly, his eyes shut, unable to keep them open as he went into blackness. Chapter 15, The Sending. Awakening, music played into his ears. Not remembering anything more, he pulled the KH-51 Kenwood headphones from his head. His eyes opened as he noticed the sign breezing past him on the passenger side. Who was driving? He wondered, as he turned facing them. It was his cousin Mitzi. She was at least 10 years older than him, now that she was driving. "Where are we heading to?" he asked her, curious. He didn't recollect the trip, or getting into the car in the first place. "You'll see, it's a surprise," she said, still staring straight into the windshield. "All right." he replied, as he turned again out the window. A sign suddenly passed them, Arkansas, 5 miles. If you must know, your father was transferred to Arkansas for work and I promised to bring you. She said smiling, this time she had her eyes on him. Are you excited? She asked. Thomas didn't understand. Where was Mother? He wondered quietly to himself. Although he didn't ask, of course. He said, trying not to sound strange. I can't believe my little cousin's going into the 11th grade. She then added, as he turned glancing at her driving. Me too, it's been a long way there. He said, as he pulled the headphones back onto his head. One pill make you larger, one pill make you small. Was blaring into his ears, White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane. Ever since they arrived in the music scene he idolized them. A moment later they turned off onto the exit ramp arriving in Arkansas. Thomas Ritter had dozed off, asleep with the headphones still around his ears. We're here, whispered Mitzi to his left. She then turned at him, noticing he had fallen asleep. Suddenly, he heard music being played. A soft piano melody was coming from somewhere, as he pulled his eyes apart. He was standing and he wasn't alone. His father was in front of him along with his entire immediate family. Cousin Mitzi was there as well. She was dabbing her face and eyes with a hand-sewn handkerchief. His father stood holding an umbrella. Rain was drizzling down as they stood closely together. Thomas stared at him. He appeared troubled and his face was bright red. As he watched him he could see his eyes were tearing up also. His head was tilted downwards, staring at the ground. A hole was dug deep into the soil there. A cave plot. His eyes blinked as he took a closer look. A large pile of dirt sat a foot from it, ready to be poured back in. He curiously turned around noticing a yellow bulldozer was parked not far from the group. Thoughts and worries suddenly came into his mind. Whose funeral was it? He wondered as he stood in the rain, dribbling down on him. Not remembering anything prior before arriving. The preacher began speaking not far from him. Jesus said to them, our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go, that I may awake him out of his sleep. No more than a few seconds had passed by, as Thomas turned towards the narrow road leading back towards the funeral home. A black Cadillac hearse was parked halfway into the grass with its back door hanging open. He could see the top end of the casket sitting there inside. As he watched, standing by the gaping grave, the pallbearers suddenly trudged over to the hearse to carry it over. 2 men he didn't recognize lifted the front of it, as his father and the neighbor Mr. West lifted the back end of it out. He turned again, peering at the cavernous hole, where there was no stone yet placed. Where was his mother? He wondered, as he began to feel sick. He remembered his brother's drowning, but that was about it, as he stood anxious and silent with his hands tucked into his dress-style pants. Something inside him told him something terrible had happened to her. The cemetery was only a mile or 2 from his parents' property. He'd been there before when his grandfather Edmund passed away. But he didn't remember that either, only Adam's untimely death plagued him.